In our last video, we talked about the perfect squares and the perfect cubes. This time, we're going to reverse that process. We're going to be finding the square roots and cube roots of our list of perfect squares and cubes. Now, if it's on the list, this process is easy. A square root asks the question, what number that if I take two of them and multiply them together gives me the number inside the radical, inside the root? For 1, for example, that number is 1 times 1. Take two copies of 1 and multiply it together, and you get 1. Therefore, the square root of 1 is 1. Well, hold on a second. There's actually two answers, because 1 times itself, 1 times 1, is 1, but the same can be said for another number. Negative 1 times negative 1. Negative 1 times itself gives me 1. So when I'm finding a square root, there's actually technically two answers. The square root of 1 could be positive 1, or it could be negative 1. Now this is something that's technically true, but sometimes we kind of omit or kind of ignore that a little bit. If you go to the Desmos, my favorite website in the whole world, and you type in the square root of x, it'll show you this graph, but it will be all positive numbers. And so sometimes we define it only as the positive version. It really depends on the situation. But if you're just given a number and told what's the square root, well, technically there's two answers there. For the square root of 4, we have to ask ourselves, well, what number can I take two of them and multiply it together to give me 4? And my answer is 2. 2 times itself is 4. The mistake that I see students make in Algebra 1 is that they mistake the question for what numbers can I multiply to give me 4? And so sometimes I'll hear students say, well, it could be 1 times 4. But that's not correct, because those aren't the same number. They need to be the same number times itself equals whatever's in the radical. So the square root of 4 is 2 because 2 times itself is 4. Likewise, the square root of 9, that's 3 times itself, and so that means that the square root of 9 is 3. And of course, let's not forget that it could be the positive version or the negative version for all of these. So let's go ahead and finish off this list. One thing that you should be able to note is that if you look at the list of perfect squares, this is exactly the same numbers, just inverted, using a different operation. So this time we're starting with the perfect square and turning it into, what was the original number. So we're going to use that same idea to help us find the perfect cubes. And likewise, if a square root is asking us what number times itself gives me the number in the root, in the radical, this time we're asking what number, if you take 3 copies of it and multiply them all together, gives me that number inside the radical. And once again for 1, that answer is 1, because 1 times itself is 1. Now the question may come up, do I have to say plus or minus 1? And no, you do not, because negative 1 times itself is not 1. It's negative 1 again. So if you have a square root and you're finding then your answer should say plus or minus. If you're finding a cube root, then your answer should only be positive. And that's going to be true actually for more than just square roots and cube roots. If you move, the farther you go, you can get to 4th roots, 5th roots, however many roots you want. And if you get to 4th roots, you have to say plus or minus again, because a negative times a negative times a negative times a negative is a positive again. And so it turns out that anytime you're finding an even root, you have to say plus or minus. And anytime you're saying an odd root, you only have to worry about the positive version. So let's go ahead and finish this list. If the number in the root was on our list of perfect squares or perfect cubes, this process is easy. You just go backwards. But what if, instead of being on our list, the number is a little bit more complicated? We have a non-perfect square root we want to find the answer to. And what do we do then? Well, that's going to be the topic of our next video when we talk about solving and simplifying general square roots and cube roots. So I'll see you then. Hope this video was helpful. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.